So Jacob agreed that none of the solid-colored animals would be taken into his own flocks. If any should be found by Laban in Jacob's flocks, Laban would have the right to take them out. Only those future animals that would be born speckled or striped or spotted or abnormatively colored in some way would become Jacob's wages. The dominant color traits in Laban's flocks and herds were evidently white among the sheep, black among the goats, brown among the cattle. Most of the animals were of these colors, but there were a few that were spotted and speckled among the cattle and goats and brown among the sheep. It was of such as these that Jacob's pay would be. That Laban probably didn't figure out it's a big deal. Just a few he would get. But, however, Jacob further proposed that not only would none of these living speckled animals be taken by him, but they would not even be used for breeding purposes. He would separate them into separate flocks and keep them away from the normal colored animals. Only such spotted and speckled animals that would be born in the future from the normal colored animals would become his. Sounds like he's an expert biologist. Since the solid-colored animals were by far the more numerous, and since it was much less likely that it would bear striped and speckled offspring than the animals that were already striped and speckled or brown among the sheep, this arrangement clearly was highly favorable to Laban and of very doubtful value to Jacob. Indeed, it was an act of pure faith on his part. He had put himself entirely at God's mercy. It will be up to the Lord to indicate by a very unlikely set of circumstances whether Jacob should prosper personally or not. Laban, who was willing to make a far more generous outlay than this to keep Jacob, immediately jumped at the chance to seal such a bargain. He would lose nothing that now belonged to him, and in all appearances Laban should not be liable for losing much in the future, for Jacob would only possess the abnormative animals, which were far fewer in number and less likely to breed many other abnormative animals. Jacob had no breeding stock of his own, and none of the animals from which his pay was to come would be likely to produce spotted and speckled progeny of their own without a spotted and speckled population with which to interbreed. So now we have 35 to 36. Morris is going to comment on that same day. He removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats that had a little white in them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob had continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks, just to make things on the up and up, I guess, Laban decided not to trust Jacob to keep the two sets of flocks separate. He himself went through the flocks, culling out all the striped and spotted goats, the brown sheep, and other odd-colored animals, and put them into a separate flock, thus assuring himself that Jacob would not leave any of them in the main flock for additional breeding and the possibility of further abnormative offspring. He just wants to multiply his chances, so greedy he was. Then, to make it quite impossible in the future for there to be any mixing, he gave the speckled flock into the hands of his sons and told them always to keep them at least 3 days' journey away from the main body of animals, which would be tended by Jacob. So, 37 to 43, Jacob took fresh-cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made the white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them in with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. I wonder if this is an interesting plan here. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and maidservants and menservants and camels and donkeys. So how does this come about? Well, Morris says, Jacob knew a great deal about sheep and goats and cattle, however, much more than Laban. He had kept his father's flocks for decades and now had been in charge of Laban's for over 14 years. As a very observant and intelligent man, he had apparently learned something about what we call Mendelian genetics, simply by long continued observation of generation after generation of these animals. He knew that even though a species of animal may have a certain dominant trait, such as the white color in this type of sheep, furthermore, actual physical vigor and usefulness for men's needs are quite independent of this manner of coloration. Jacob selectively breeded the animals with the recessive trait of abnormative coloration, with one another in such a manner as to increase their numbers even more than under normative conditions of herd life. A certain proportion of the solid-colored animals would be homozygous, in this case with the same abnormative colored genes, and if mated with other homozygous animals would bear only solid-colored offspring. The heterozygous animals, which did contain in some proportion the genes for off-colored progeny, would be the ones which would have to supply his own future flocks. But by selective breeding he could eventually develop a flock of predominantly spotted and speckled animals. So he knows this. This is scientific. Critics raise questions about Jacob's knowledge of science. Well, just by observation. See, he didn't have to go to some kind of a science college. His actions in peeling white stripes and rods from trees of poplar, hazel, and chestnut, or perhaps much more likely storax, almond, and plane trees, as rendered in the NIV, and placing them in the cattle watering troughs, have been attacked as showing his belief in the outmoded ideas of prenatal influence. The idea is that Jacob supposed by making the animals look at striped rods at that time of conception, he would induce them to bring forth striped offspring. The doctrine of prenatal influence is, of course, believed by modern zoologists to be nothing but an old wives' tale. But it should not be overlooked, however, that Jacob was over 90 years old at this time, and that he was a very intelligent and a careful observer, and that he had spent most of his long life raising and studying cattle, sheep, and goats. He would have been most unlikely to have been taken in by a groundless superstition. There is a great deal even today that the scientists have not been able to work out concerning the transmission of hereditary factors. In a certain population there are multitudes of different characteristics which may appear in different individual animals of that species. The variational potential in the DNA molecular structure is tremendous. Exactly what it is that determines the actual characteristics a particular individual animal may have out of all the potential characteristics that are theoretically available in the gene pool is not yet known in any significant degree, at all. It may be that Jacob had learned certain things about these animals which modern biologists have not yet even approached. His results were positive. There are indeed certain factors which can become prenatal influences and which can determine to some degree the physical characteristics of the progeny, though it is surely very unlikely that an external image can be transmitted through the visual apparatus to the brain, and thus in some way as a signal to the DNA structure to specify certain characteristics to be triggered in the embryo. It is nevertheless true that certain chemicals can and do have a significant prenatal influence if they can reach the embryo or, prior to the conception, the DNA in the germ cells. It is possible that certain chemicals in the wood of these trees, peeled rods of which were actually in the water which the flocks came to drink, were capable somehow of affecting the animals. If nothing else, water treated thus may have served as an aphrodisiac and fertility promoter among the cattle and other animals. And he selected the ones that he felt were the stronger ones, the ones that he wanted to produce with their characteristics. At least one such chemical substance found in these trees has been actually used for such a purpose in both ancient and modern times. He just didn't know scientifically. He didn't go to modern-day agricultural school. Gee whiz. Further, whether or not the sense of sight can actually mark the embryo in some way, there is no doubt that what one sees may have a strong effect on certain physiological mechanisms on his body. The phenomena of blushing, the nauseous reactions produced by viewing gruesome sights, and the effect of pornographic pictures in stimulating the sexual apparatus are typical cases in point. The mere sight of the striped rods may have served simply as an aphrodisiac to the cattle when they came to drink, and don't forget he selected out the ones he wanted to procreate. They were the same type that he wanted. This, in fact, seems indicated by verse 38, in which the word translated conceived in the King James Version, in heat, NIV, is actually the Hebrew yacham, meaning to be hot or be in heat. That is, the very verse may be read, and he set the rods which he peeled before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should become hot or in heat when they came to drink. So he's getting them ready to procreate, and he's selecting the ones to procreate. So that's in and of itself is common sense among farmers. In some way not understood, but apparently confirmed by many practical animal raisers since, the sight of white streaked rods seems to stimulate these animals to sexual activity. There you go. It's not superstition. The bulk of the animals, which were Laban's, were made by Jacob to face toward the separate flock of speckled and spotted lambs, but were kept separate from them. The reason for having them thus oriented is not clear. Perhaps it was to make a subconscious impression on them that stripes and speckles were a mark of distinction in the flock, so as to make preparations for and augment the aphrodisiac influences of the striped rods. It is possible that as a symbolic gesture, he had them face toward the 3 days distinct flock of Laban's ring-streaked cattle. Though they could not see them, this might have symbolized Jacob's confidence that Laban's pure color flock would eventually produce a new ring-streaked flock for himself. A further measure was taken by Jacob to ensure that the flocks so produced would be composed of strong animals. He divided the flocks into 2 shifts, composed of stronger and weaker animals respectively. He used the rods in the troughs when the stronger animals drank, but not when the weaker ones came there. Thus the stronger animals were stimulated to mate, and the others were not. This measure, likewise, to the extent it would be effective, constituted a sound practice of animal husbandry, and should have been as a great benefit to Laban as to Jacob. He would ensure that, statistically at least, most of the newborn lambs and kids, whether solid-colored or spotted, would be sturdy and healthy. However, there continued to be produced an abnormally large proportion of spotted and speckled young. This meant that a greater and greater percentage of the animals in Jacob's flock were strong animals, and an increasing percentage in Laban's were weaker animals. So he was being very selective about who he wanted to mate, and then excited them to mate. It was not until later that Jacob came to understand the providential intervention that caused the unusual percentage of streaked and spotted animals to be born. So, the angel of the Lord in 11-13 said to me in the dream, Jacob, I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, and where you were made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once, and go back to your native land. So in the meantime, within a sphere of only a few years, perhaps 4 or 5, Jacob's flock had grown so large, and he had prospered from it so greatly, that he had to employ many servants, both male and female, and had purchased many cattle, camels, and asses. And he had quickly become a very prosperous rancher. He had done so not by any dishonest manipulation of his own, or by some mystical methodology that some maintain, but by means of sound practices of animal breeding, which, by all normal standards, should have been of even greater benefit to Laban than to himself. So the God of his fathers, however, had to intervene in a marvelous and supernatural way. So, is there any contradiction here? Absolutely not. He, by dint of his experience and observation, he was able to do standard husbandry practices using the stronger animals to mate, and making sure that they produced a greater percentage of spotted animals. And so then the great majority of the herd were spotted and streaked. End of story. So, let's go back to the next topic. So Jacob's scheme to multiply was a good husbandry idea, because he had experience raising herds. We'll go back to the next one. Are bats incorrectly referred to in the Bible? And again, we have one of these things that it's exciting to go through and investigate these things and find the great plausibility of these things, despite the objections of other people. But we'll more on this next time about the bats.